I fervently hope that Australia will have its first Indigenous Prime Minister within my and your lifetimes, and that Indigenous Prime Minister will be a Conservative Indigenous Prime Minister, because, in my opinion, only a strong Conservative government will have the wherewithal to pull Indigenous Australia out of the socialist swamp bequeathed to it by successive governments, and only a Conservative government led by an Indigenous Australian will be able to defeat the gargantuan forces of the activist left. Indigenous Australians in remote communities certainly deserve to have such a Prime Minister. There's only a couple of things which stand in the way of such an outcome, the main one of which is the referendum on the voice. In my opinion, the voice, by definition, will torpedo any chance of a Conservative Indigenous parliamentarian rising to the top. I'll explain why in a second. Remember, at its most basic, the voice is a racist concept, as Nigel Farage was just saying, based solely on the idea that there are weird, intangible differences between human beings based on their genetic makeup. It is no different in principle to any of the racist ideologies and beliefs that have blighted mankind's history. Those who support it either willfully ignore that fact or attempt to disguise or deny it with sophistry and humbug on steroids. There are two fatuous arguments currently circulating which attempt to prop up Conservative support for the voice. Both are entirely fallacious. The first is that being Indigenous isn't a racial concept at all. It is actually all to do with how long you have been genetically connected to the geography of the continent of Australia. This is preposterous. When I was a kid and a migrant family would move down the street there in Canberra, we'd all excitedly be told, there are some new Australians who have just moved into number so-and-so. New Australians was a term coined by Labor's Immigration Minister Arthur Calwell in the immediate aftermath of World War II, in an attempt to avoid racial slurs and to promote assimilation. The term caught on, and by the 1960s, New Australians were also our new mates.
Where you been?
I had to pick up your new mate, mate. How you going, mate, all right?
Yeah, mate, how you going, all right?
All right, mate. Nino, this is Pat. Pat, Nino.
Pleased to meet you.
How do you do?
All right, mate.
That was assimilation. But then, of course, with the onset of political correctness, assimilation fell out of favour, became a dirty word with the left, and multiculturalism became the new creed. This was deeply cynical politics on the part of Labor and the left, who realised it was more in their interest to keep migrants in ethnically based areas in order to, as Mark Zuckerberg famously put it, fortify the Labor migrant vote. So it became offensive now to call people New Australians, we were repeatedly told, because this was racist and implied they were not as authentic as Anglo-Saxon Australians, and that just because you were a new arrival to this continent, it was outrageous to suggest you were in any way less legitimate. So the term New Australian disappeared faster than the froth on a flat schooner of Resch's DA. Yet, now, those who support the voice are re-promoting this very concept, claiming that the longer you can trace back your ancestry on this continent we're on, the more legitimate your claims to authenticity are, and you therefore deserve political rights and a voice beyond the laws of the land that Parliament and the courts must pay attention to, because it is written in the Constitution that you are special because you are an old Australian, which trumps being a new Australian. The second fatuous argument I've heard recently is that, quote, the voice can do no significant harm, because if it becomes radically left-wing, quote, it will be ignored by Parliament and the public. This argument is almost satirical. The reality is that there is not a single, not one publicly funded institution in this country that has not drifted dramatically to the left, frequently to the extreme left. Not one. Regardless of how they begin or whatever their remit, all publicly funded institutions in this country have become dominated by the left. Whether it is the ABC, whose charter demands they represent all Australian political viewpoints, what a joke, but who are universally of the left, often the hard green left, whether it is the joke bodies like the Australian Human Rights Commission, who we didn't hear a peep out of during COVID when Australians were being arrested in their pyjamas or attacked with rubber bullets or losing their jobs, not a peep. Yet the same mob who persecuted my mate Bill Leak right up to his untimely death for drawing a friggin' cartoon, whether it is the courts who recently discovered in the Love case that apparently self-identifying Indigenous Australians have some magical connection to the land that places them above the law, whether it is our universities, our schools, our libraries, our public service departments. You cannot name a single body funded by the taxpayer that does not do the bidding of the left. So why would the voice be any different? The answer is, of course, it won't be. Which is why Labor is so determined to implement the voice. They'll never have to worry again about arguing a case or implementing crazy leftist policies. All they'll have to do is lob it over to the voice, they'll tick it off, and hey, presto, no Parliament, to paraphrase Anthony Albanese, will dare oppose their recommendations. That was what Albo said. Which brings me back to current politics and the tantalising prospect that within our lifetimes we could have an Indigenous Prime Minister, and a Conservative one at that. Yesterday, one of the most significant events in our recent history took place appropriately outside our federal Parliament. Without written notes, speaking straight from the heart, Senator Jacinta Yangapi Nampijinpa Price, the Country Liberal Party Senator for the Northern Territory, spelled out her opposition to the voice. Her arguments are clear, concise, considered, and come at personal cost. She has already been attacked by Noel Pearson as a redneck or some such nonsense. But forget all that. What was so important is that as Senator Price made her comments, the entire Nationals Party stood behind her, literally and figuratively, including leader David Littleproud. Now, I'm the first to confess I've been very critical of Mr. Littleproud in the past, particularly on his insane climate change advocacy, but yesterday he deserved a new nickname. Forget David Littleproud. From now on in my books, he is David Much to be Proud of.
I want to thank my Nationals colleagues for the very hard work that we've undergone to speak to those in our communities, to understand what it is on the ground that Indigenous Australians are looking for, and it is not more division in this country. We are part of a liberal, democratic Australia, and one of our fundamental principles is that we are all regarded as equal under the law.
Just 2 days ago, on Sunday morning on Outsiders, following the disastrous election results in Victoria, I specifically called on Peter Dutton to call a press conference on Monday morning, yesterday, to stand behind Jacinta Price and oppose the voice. Indeed, at the Conservative CPAC conference a couple of months ago, I upset many Liberals when I accused Mr Dutton of failing to, literally, get behind Jacinta Price and oppose the voice. Where Peter Dutton and the Liberals have failed repeatedly, David, much to be proud of, and the Nationals have succeeded. Congratulations. Senator Price's speech is about 6 minutes long, and it is well worth watching in full. It is insightful. She points out that Indigenous Australians are fed up with virtue signalling and airy-fairy concepts, of being treated as different, as somehow unable to be fully in control, of their own individual destiny. It is poignant. She talks of the chronic failure of ATSIC in the past and points out that the voice is simply ATSIC rebooted. It is tragic, lamenting those many marginalised Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, who fall through the cracks. She mocks those Gucci Aborigines in their private airplanes flying in to tell remote communities how to live.
There are Indigenous Australians who do not agree with this, who do not know what this means. Minister Burney might be able to take a private jet out into a remote community dripping with Gucci and tell people in the dirt what's good for them, but they are in the dark, and they have been in the dark. And the very reason why I chose to fight to become a senator for the Northern Territory was to make sure that people like that were understood also. And that is why we have, in our nation's history, for the first time, 11 Indigenous Australians representing not just Indigenous Australians, but all Australians within Parliament. This concept that has no detail undermines those voices that have worked hard to be elected into the Australian Parliament.
And there you have it. I believe that Senator Price has the strength, the wisdom and the integrity to rise to the very top of Australian politics. She is a Conservative warrior and is passionate about helping Aboriginal Australia, particularly the women and the children who have suffered so much abuse. But the harsh reality is that the greatest blight on Indigenous communities in Australia is the patronising quasi-communism introduced by Gough Whitlam and his acolyte, the starry-eyed leftist Nugget Coombs, back in the 1970s, where community chiefs grab all the money and nobody has any individual property or ownership rights. Until this concept is dismantled, no amount of walking across the harbour bridge or waving smoking branches around or wearing funky t-shirts will close the gap. As we have seen repeatedly, Conservative cowards will always fail at the ballot box. The Matthew Guys, the ScoMos, the Sharmas, the Wilsons, the Zimmermans. Left-leaning so-called Conservatives are electoral poison. Only Conservatives with the integrity and intellect and above all bravery of a Jacinta Price are capable of genuinely getting to grips with policies that will actually change the world, actually improve, for example, chronic Indigenous disadvantage. But the tragic reality is that the policies that the left favours, and by definition the policies that a constitutionally enshrined voice will demand and insist on, regardless of what Parliament says, are the very policies that are to blame for creating and perpetuating the current dismal state of affairs. I believe Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price has the vision that Australia needs. She could go all the way in our political system. She can provide the intellectual heft, the moral and brave leadership needed to confront the socialist monstrosity that blights much of Indigenous Australia's future prospects. Jobs are needed. Private property ownership is needed. Opportunity and education are needed. But as Senator Price herself appears to recognise, a powerful political and legal body such as The Voice makes it almost certain that any policies a Conservative government might actually eventually manage to get up through our tough and adversarial parliamentary system to change the future for Indigenous Australians, to change their world, would never get past The Voice. That is the tragedy, that those who support this voice are prepared to inflict upon this nation for the sake of their selfish virtue signalling. In order to empower an elite group of Indigenous activists and bureaucrats, you would disempower those Indigenous members of Parliament, and I include all 11 of them in this, who are prepared to devote their lives, their energies, their efforts, their passion to the political process. Hang your heads in shame, honestly.
We have to stop dividing our nation along the lines of race and recognise our contribution to this nation, from the first people of this country to the migrant people who have come here and made this their home, to those with convict backgrounds. We have come together to create one of the world's greatest nations, and we should start celebrating this fact.